Donald Trump is the first Republican president to transcend the paradigm that had been created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. They basically cast aside the old Constitution that had been written by our founding fathers, and they created something entirely new. Not only is Trump reclaiming the powers of his office as the head of the executive branch, but also President Trump is restoring the idea that Americans are responsible for having a foreign policy that is in our national interest. Trump and younger conservatives are actually fighting a much bigger battle than these earlier 20th century conservatives had been fighting. The New York Times' conservative columnist Ross Douthat recently had a very provocative piece in the newspaper. He argued that Donald Trump's second term has ended the conservative era. Basically, the era of Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley has been drawn to a close by President Trump's actions in his second term. Now, there are many people on the right who actually do feel that way, especially older, perhaps baby boom generation conservatives, who think that Donald Trump is a complete negation of everything that the conservative movement had stood for in the era of Ronald Reagan and earlier. Of course, there are many people on the right who don't accept that at all and who say that actually there's a great deal of continuity between President Trump and the Republican presidents of the Cold War era and, for that matter, somewhat earlier as well. So is the conservative movement now gone? Is the conservative era over? Or is it in fact evolving or perhaps changing into something that is more suited for the conditions of the 21st century? Well, I recently tackled this question at a website called TomKlingenstein.com, which is the website of Tom Klingenstein, the eponymous creator of the site, who is in fact the chairman of the Claremont Institute. And this is an organization which the left has demonized in many respects. They say the Claremont Institute is a kind of malevolent think tank that is secretly driving the agenda of Donald Trump. In fact, the Claremont Institute is an organization that promotes political philosophy. It is very dear, very devoted to the memory of Harry Jaffa, a professor who looked at the philosophical side of Abraham Lincoln, who tried to understand the American political tradition in light of ancients like Aristotle and Plato. The Claremont Institute certainly does have, a number of high-profile people who are alumni who have gone into the Trump administration. Michael Anton, for example, who is really the mastermind of the most recent national security strategy, is a Claremont alumnus, as are a number of other people in the administration. So it's certainly, the Claremont Institute is an organization that has a political background to it. But it's really not primarily about politics. It's primarily about philosophy and about much bigger picture questions. So I recently wrote a piece for Tom Klingenstein's personal website, TomKlingenstein.com. And in this article, I argued that in fact, Donald Trump is the first Republican president in 80 years, basically, going back all the way, to the 1930s. He's the first Republican president to transcend the paradigm and the sort of rules and conditions that had been created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. So let me crystallize this a little bit more. It's not that the conservative era is over, as Ross Douthat argues. It's rather that what the conservative era was just a footnote in many ways to the New Deal Franklin Roosevelt era. And what we have known as conservatism for the past 80 years has in large part been defined by its opposition to the New Deal, its opposition to the spirit that Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought to the Democratic Party and to America as a whole. And the conservative movement of this, supposedly conservative era was actually, as I say, a footnote to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt era, and wound up being unsuccessful at trying to stop and roll back the New Deal and the big government that really began in spades with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, let me specify a little bit more about Franklin Roosevelt and his connection to the deep state today, the administrative state, and the condition of the Democratic Party in the 21st century. Because you might think, well, look, what could be less relevant in the 2020s than the politics of the 1930s and perhaps even the 1940s. So you have Franklin Roosevelt elected, in the wake of the Great Depression, which gets started at the end of the 1920s. Franklin Roosevelt comes into power and he starts using government to try to combat the Depression and to try to stabilize American business, He does this, of course, not through free market means, but instead by expanding government, by creating a litany of alphabet agencies, all kinds of things, some of which still exist and some of which don't. The Works Progress Administration and any number of others. In many cases, the government is actually, directly hiring basically an army of laborers to go out and dig ditches, sometimes even things that are completely uneconomical. It's doing these things simply in order to try to get Americans back to work in the wake of the Great Depression. And of course, it doesn't really work. There is a continuing sense that America is in a very dark place economically. Unemployment continues to be quite high, very high indeed by modern standards. And there's overall a sense that, America's free market system has been destroyed, that in fact, Franklin Roosevelt isn't reviving it. He's having to replace it with a more managed economy or perhaps even a more socialistic economy. And not only that, but also within the Franklin Roosevelt administration, there are a number of officials who take a benign view of the relatively recently created Soviet Union. Some of these officials are later exposed as actual communist agents, but many others are communist sympathizers, and they certainly like the spirit of the Soviet Union. They think the Soviet Union, it's secular, it's modern, it's post-capitalist, it's going to bring about a new era for humanity that's going to be peaceful and more prosperous, and we need to do something similar in America with the New Deal. So again, maybe they're not outright, Stalinists, but they certainly are believers in the use of scientific expertise and vast government power, in fact, infinite government power, to reconstruct the economy and reconstruct society in order to change humanity for the better. This is the progressive vision that basically is at the heart of the New Deal and what Franklin Roosevelt is trying to do as president. Roosevelt, of course, is elected to 4 consecutive terms as president, and then after his death, he's succeeded by his last vice president, Harry Truman, and Truman then wins a 5th consecutive presidential election for the Democratic Party. So we're talking about 20 straight consecutive years of Democratic Party control of the executive branch of the White House. Now, Democrats had already taken control of Congress. They win the House of Representatives in 1930, even before Franklin Roosevelt, and then basically they hold on to the House of Representatives all the way up until the Republican victory of 1994. So we're talking about 64 years. There are 2 brief interruptions in that 64-year period when Democrats do not control the House of Representatives, but those 2 interruptions are so slight as to have very little overall effect. So during the Truman era in the 1950s, and then also during the Eisenhower era, the Truman era in the late 40s, and then in the Eisenhower era in the 50s, there are 2 brief, interruptions where Republicans take control of the House of Representatives for 2 years at a time. But other than that, you've got pretty much 64 straight years of Democratic control of the United States House of Representatives. And most of that time, you also have Democratic control of the Senate, although there's a little more contest there. As I mentioned, you had 20 consecutive straight years of Democratic power in the White House with FDR and then Harry Truman. And even when Republicans did win the White House back under Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, Eisenhower was really a bipartisan or a nonpartisan figure. He was not a Republican. He was not really a self-conscious conservative. Dwight Eisenhower was a national hero of World War II. He was a general who was seen as being above politics. And he decided to run on the Republican Party ticket, maybe for one of 2 reasons. And depending on your point of view, you might see one reason as being more powerful or perhaps the other. So a more benign view of why Eisenhower decided to run for office on the Republican ticket was precisely that as a nonpartisan, as a man above politics, Dwight Eisenhower recognized that the Democratic Party had had power for too long, and the Republican Party was too badly damaged. It was incapable of rebuilding itself on its own, and therefore a nonpartisan figure had to intervene, rescue the Republican Party, bring it back into power in order to restore a little bit of bipartisan balance to Washington, D.C. And that's what this great nonpartisan hero, this general from World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, was going to do for the Republican Party in order to help create, once again, a 2-party system in Washington, D.C., even if the 2 parties were not necessarily necessarily very far apart philosophically. And in fact, a number of thinkers in the 1950s, a number of conservative thinkers, in fact, argued that there really wasn't all that much difference between Franklin Roosevelt and many of the Democrats he was running against. People like Adlai Stevenson, for example. That's a name that's now mostly forgotten from history. But Adlai Stevenson had been the Democratic nominee against Franklin Roosevelt, and Adlai Stevenson had been the Democratic nominee against Dwight Eisenhower, and Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower were often seen as being not very philosophically different. So the more benign view of Dwight Eisenhower is, well, he was trying to make sure that we at least had nominally two separate parties, and that there was some balance between Democrats and Republicans. A darker view of what Dwight Eisenhower was doing says that Dwight Eisenhower was someone who basically wasn't restoring a balance. He wasn't, helping the Republican Party and its relatively conservative elements balance out the Democrats who had had power for 20 years. But then actually what Dwight Eisenhower was doing was the exact opposite. He was coming in and he was basically kicking Republicans out of their own party. He was putting himself in charge. He was a wartime hero, so everyone in both parties loved him. So he got the Republican nomination in 1952. Dwight Eisenhower defeated Robert Taft for the nomination. Robert Taft was a United States senator from Ohio who was basically seen, in fact, who was known as Mr. Conservative. Robert Taft was someone who was philosophically, as well as in terms of the label next to his name, a Republican and a conservative. And Dwight Eisenhower basically, in some respects, hijacked the Republican Party from Robert Taft. And as a result, you could say that Dwight Eisenhower produced a situation in which you just had two elections, 1952 and 1956, that were really two New Dealers against one another. And that Dwight Eisenhower was not going to roll back the New Deal. Dwight Eisenhower was not going to change or reverse the alterations that Franklin Roosevelt had made to government. So there's a sense in which not only did you have 5 consecutive terms, 20 straight years of Democratic power in the White House from Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, but also that Dwight Eisenhower really continued that Democratic monopoly on power, even if he had an R next to his name. And of course, after Dwight Eisenhower, you have the 1960 election, where the Democrat John F. Kennedy winds up winning. And after Kennedy's assassination, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, becomes president. Lyndon Johnson then uses the opportunity presented by Kennedy's assassination to have another transformative set of policies in America. And in some ways, Lyndon Johnson is the man who completes the New Deal, and he does this by creating, new entitlements, Medicaid, for example, and Medicare. President Johnson is also, of course, the president who gets America most deeply involved in the Vietnam War. And a number of commentators, a number of critics, both on the left and on the right in subsequent years, have said, in a weird way, the Vietnam War is actually a kind of attempt to bring the New Deal or to bring Lyndon Johnson's Great Society to Vietnam. Now, that didn't mean, creating a welfare state in Vietnam, but it did mean trying to micromanage things, trying to, promote, a kind of Johnson-style or Franklin Roosevelt-style version of Americanism and liberal democracy. And it failed. It basically, was not able to prevent communists from taking over all of Vietnam. So you have a number of, or a very long succession of presidential administrations stretching all the way from Franklin Roosevelt through to Lyndon Johnson that are basically philosophically all on the same page. They are all entrenching and expanding what Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal set up. Now, I should back up a little bit. When we talk about the end of the conservative era, as Ross Douthat mentions in the New York Times, there's often a sense that this means the end of an era where conservatives have been fighting for smaller government, and the end of an era where conservatives have been defined by their opposition to the welfare state. Franklin Roosevelt was really the architect of the modern American welfare state, and so you might say, well, in the end of the conservative era, if we're no longer fighting against the welfare state, then that means that Franklin Roosevelt wins, that we simply have a continuation now of what the Democrats had built in the 30s and 40s and onwards. But the New Deal actually means a heck of a lot more than just the welfare state. And there's a sense in which the fact that so much of conservative politics during the Cold War and, at the end of the 20th century and even in the first 2 decades of the 21st century now, so much of what was called the conservative movement, what Ross Douthat refers to as the conservative era, was concerned with only trying to combat a very narrow part of the revolution, the basic transformation in our government that Franklin Roosevelt accomplished. So yes, conservatives criticized the welfare state. They tried to roll it back. They were mostly unsuccessful in that. They had some limited successes, but in general, the successes they had were successes in stopping the creation of new expansions of the welfare state. You had some success in taking out some of the things that Lyndon Johnson had put in the 1960s. But in general, this idea that conservatives were fighting a winning battle against big government is not true at all. Conservatives might have been fighting the battle, but they were losing it. And they were losing it, time and time again. So in a sense, conservatives restricted their opposition to the New Deal just to what it had done to create the welfare state. And they neglected everything else that had been connected with the New Deal and with, subsequently Franklin Roosevelt's actions and the rest of his administration, and with the national security state that gets built up by Roosevelt and then subsequently by Harry Truman. Think about all the other changes that Franklin Roosevelt and his successor Harry Truman brought to America. They basically cast aside the old Constitution that had been written by our founding fathers, and they created something entirely new. This is the true meaning of the New Deal. It's not just about building a welfare state. It's about fundamentally reconceiving of not only the relationship of Washington to the rest of the country, but also the relationship of America to the world and the relationship of our national security apparatus, our intelligence agencies, and the military to Americans themselves and to the rest of the world. And obviously, there's a tendency for textbooks that are written by liberals to emphasize Franklin Roosevelt as a, man who was challenging totalitarianism around the world and fighting the Nazis, even though he was allied with another totalitarian, namely Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. What's important, however, is that after World War II, we never came home. And in fact, we looked at the Soviet threat and we said, well, we're going to build a national security apparatus to fight the Soviet threat. Now, for conservatives and for people on the right, it makes sense to have wanted to fight the Soviet Union, to want to counteract the power of the Soviet Union, to want to try to prevent the spread of communism in Europe and elsewhere. All of that is quite logical and sensible. But conservatives at the time were quite critical of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman because they saw that basically Truman and Roosevelt were not fighting communism in the name of the ideals and principles and philosophy of the Founding Fathers and the Declaration of Independence and the old America. Instead, it was basically their version of statism, their New Dealism, versus the Soviet version. So you would have a softer, milder version, perhaps, of state power, but it would definitely be similar in many respects to what the Soviets themselves saw as being the purpose of the state. But in so many other respects, too, the New Deal is actually a profoundly radical diversion and departure from America's traditions. America had traditionally been very much skeptical of having open-ended commitments to policing the world. We had a number of interventions in foreign affairs going back to the War of 1812 and certainly the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. But in general, even by the end of the 19th century, even in the early decades of the 20th century, Americans were very skeptical of going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, as President John Quincy Adams, had said when he was Secretary of State to James Monroe. Americans, even in the 1920s, of course, were very skeptical of foreign interventions. Americans had had a very bad experience under the Democratic President Woodrow Wilson with World War I, and therefore, at the end of World War I, we basically said, hey, we're never doing this again. Basically, our founding fathers were right. We do not want to get entangled in Europe's wars, and therefore, we're going back to a pretty strong non-interventionism in foreign policy. Well, of course, World War II then comes along and challenges that, complicates that, and eventually the Japanese attack us at Pearl Harbor, and we wind up getting drawn into World War II. But we could have said after the end of World War II, you know what, we're going to take some measures to counteract communism, but we're not going to think of ourselves as the world's policeman. We're not going to try to be a permanent presence in Europe. What we want to do is strengthen Europe, strengthen places like Japan so that they're capable of resisting communism themselves. Yes, we'll be an ally, we'll help them, but we're not necessarily going to say that we have the primary responsibility for fighting these conflicts all around the world. And even if you say, well, okay, during the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was a superpower, it was necessary for the United States to be a bit more of a globally involved from Japan and East Asia through Europe and elsewhere. Even if you say the Cold War was an exception, after the Cold War, you'd think, okay, now we really can become a normal nation again. Now we do not have to have these, sort of permanent, open-ended commitments to policing the world and trying to, micromanage what's happening. We don't have to have a global New Deal and a global Great Society that are the purpose of America's involvement all around the planet. And yet, what we had, of course, after the end of the Cold War, was a continuation, basically, under new guises, under some modifications, but a continuation, basically, of the same sort of view that was characteristic of Franklin Roosevelt and of Harry Truman. America continued to have this idea that we would be policemen for the world, that internationalism was more important than nationalism, and that America would have these open-ended commitments, and we would keep expanding them as well. We would start policing new areas of the world. We would expand NATO, etc. So all of this internationalism and interventionism wedded to an internationalist ideology, which often sells itself under the name of sort of global human rights. This became a pillar of both political parties, up until the rise of Donald Trump. So the Franklin Roosevelt didn't just revolutionize America domestically by creating a welfare state. Franklin Roosevelt also profoundly changed the way that America thinks about its mission in the world, and he shifted us from a focus on ourselves as a nation state to instead a focus on ourselves as a policeman and a sort of a welfare officer and a social worker for the entire planet under a system of internationalism. This is why, by the way, critics of Donald Trump's foreign policy will say, well, he's dismantling what they like to call the liberal international order. Well, really, that's a kind of Franklin Roosevelt-built liberal international order. By the way, it was Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who subsequently, is in charge of the United Nations Committee, which creates the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And while, talking about human rights seems like a nice thing that doesn't have any kind of bad implications for the world, when you combine this idea of the United Nations with this notion of a Charter of Human Rights that is actually radically different from America's own Declaration of Independence. It is, in fact, the nullification of the Declaration of Independence in many respects, because the Declaration of Independence says basically individuals pool their rights together, they come together, and in order to defend their rights, they form a people, and the people then forms a government. And this government is then responsible for protecting their rights. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, on the other hand, doesn't talk about, a people forming a government because, of course, the United Nations does not represent a people. The United Nations represents governments that are represented, by, the officials, the diplomats they send to the United Nations itself. Americans as a people, other peoples and other nations around the world, you get no vote in the United Nations. The United Nations does not represent you. The United Nations is not built and based upon, the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. No, the United Nations is all about this idea that unelected bureaucrats and experts and human rights lawyers get to determine what rights actually mean and then get to bully or coerce all other nations around the world in terms of enforcement. So it's basically a hijacking and reversal of the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. It says instead of, individual human rights being the basis for a people to create a government of their own. Instead, this is going to say that you don't get to have a government of your own, that, maybe you do, but that government is going to be subject to the rules and the ideology that are imposed from above by the mandarins of the United Nations. And Eleanor Roosevelt was an architect of this. So there's a very important connection between Franklin Roosevelt's internationalism, and his outlook on U.S. foreign policy, which again, it's about World War II, but it's really about much more than that as well. There's a connection between that and then Eleanor Roosevelt's ideological work with the United Nations, after her husband's death. So you also have, during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, as a measure that was meant to be a sort of response to the problems of international trade, which had come about thanks to the Great Depression, Roosevelt is also the harbinger of free trade for America and for the world. So Roosevelt is not only the architect of the welfare state, Franklin Roosevelt is also the architect of this global international order based on free trade and America as the world's policeman. Now, these were elements of the Franklin Roosevelt order, not just the New Deal, but something even bigger than that, a transformation of America from the republic that our founding fathers created to something that's basically an empire of, sort of expert managerialists trying to micromanage not only domestic affairs, but also, world affairs as well. These experts all thought of themselves as liberals, but they were statist liberals, on the model of Roosevelt himself. These were not the kind of liberals you had in the 19th century. This kind of international liberalism, which did include free trade as well as this, sort of open-ended American mission around the world, this, as well as the welfare state, were the legacies of Franklin Roosevelt, and these were legacies that continued to be built upon by Harry Truman, to some extent by Dwight Eisenhower, and then certainly by John F. Kennedy and by Lyndon Johnson more than anyone. And even once Republicans, who actually were Republicans, started winning the White House again, people like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, nonetheless, they were reluctant in many cases even to take on the welfare state, which conservatives ideologically, said they were opposed to. And they were completely, against trying to dismantle some of these other legacies of Franklin Roosevelt in terms of free trade and, international interventionism. Again, the Cold War was a complicating factor then. But at the end of the Cold War, you have not only a Democrat who comes into office, Bill Clinton, who continues not only to maintain, but in many respects expand this Franklin Roosevelt vision of free trade and international interventionism, globally policing the planet. But also you have Republicans in that era, in the 1990s, who were going along with this. And you have a number of intellectuals, some of whom even think of themselves as conservatives, who are basically, part of this kind of New Deal dispensation. All of this, by the way, is also tied in with those alphabet agencies I referred to earlier. This idea that the federal government is supposed to be a domain of scientific expertise, which will solve everything from, healthcare and epidemiology to, international relations, to, the structure of the family. All these things are going to be micromanaged from Washington, D.C. by experts in alphabet agencies. And even though conservatives, during the next 80 years would often say, well, we don't like this, we think that Washington has too much power, they were not very effective at all in dismantling all these alphabet agencies and dismantling this enormous presence and power of the New Deal ideology and Franklin Roosevelt's democratic ideology within the United States. It's very telling, in fact, that even when Republicans tried to dismantle the most puny of the additions that have been created by Lyndon Johnson to this enormous new Democratic Leviathan. When Republicans in the 1990s under Newt Gingrich tried to end the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and taxpayer subsidies for PBS and NPR, the Republicans were crushed. They were completely outmaneuvered. They were demonized in the media, and the Republicans wound up giving up the effort. Even though they controlled Congress, they controlled the House and the Senate, they could have done this if they wanted to. They didn't have the fortitude or the organization even to defeat the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So the idea that they were going to do anything to privatize Social Security or to rein in the welfare state, that was mostly nonsense. And Republicans and conservatives would talk and talk and talk about small government and about, getting rid of the welfare state. But that was all they talked about. They wouldn't talk about the problems in foreign policy that had been created by the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. They wouldn't talk about the problems that were being created by free trade. And in fact, Republicans, were more inclined to actually contribute to these problems. They wanted to, be internationalists of a Republican kind. They wanted to be free traders of a Republican kind. And this became so entrenched in the very brains of Republicans and indeed conservatives that by the 2020s, by the 2010s, most Republicans and conservatives had completely forgotten that they ever had, a philosophy before they started defining themselves as both continuators of the Roosevelt dispensation and as, partial critics of it, as critics simply of the welfare state component of what Franklin Roosevelt had built. So conservatives themselves had become basically Franklin Roosevelt Democrats. And in fact, if you look at what a lot of conservative journalists and various conservative politicians had said during this era, they would often be very explicit about this. So back in the 1950s, in the pages of the conservative magazine National Review was very critical of Dwight Eisenhower. National Review was extremely critical of Harry Truman. Harry Truman was seen as the man who lost China, who forfeited China to the communists. Truman was seen as a complete disaster. Well, by the early 2000s, places like National Review were running articles talking about how Harry Truman was, the sort of ideal president that we should get back to, especially in foreign policy. This was really what conservatives were saying during the early years of the so-called War on Terror. This is what the conservative movement had come around to. So basically, and you can look at Republican politicians, to some degree this is true. This is, Newt Gingrich says this, even Ronald Reagan says this. They identify themselves as people who want to stand up for the Franklin Roosevelt legacy, who actually see themselves as being continuators of Franklin Roosevelt's legacy, not as staunch opponents of it. Yes, they were critical of the welfare state, but in most respects, they wanted to restore America to the Franklin Roosevelt, philosophy and dispensation. And they were quite explicit about this. Ronald Reagan would say, hey, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. What he meant by that was that the Democratic Party of the Roosevelt era had been replaced by a more socially radical and a more, anti-American kind of left-wing Democratic Party starting in the 1960s. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that Ronald Reagan was a pure, FDR New Dealer or anything like that. He wasn't. Reagan really was someone who wanted to reform. But think of it in that term. Reagan was a reformer. He was not a counter-revolutionary. He wanted to roll back some of the things that Franklin Roosevelt had done, but not to dismantle the entire legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, Reagan was ultimately most concerned with winning the Cold War. And the questions that conservatives have had to ask themselves since 1989 has been, what do we do in the aftermath of the Cold War? How do we think about our foreign policy? How do we think about free trade? Which, during the Cold War even free trade was something that was seen as a Cold War stratagem. Well, now that the Cold War is over, how do we think about our internationalism, our trade relations, and for that matter, these expert alphabet agencies, the intelligence agencies, this entire apparatus, this Leviathan in Washington, D.C., which was built primarily by Democrats, which was, sort of overseen by a Democratic Congress, again, for almost consecutively for 60 years or so, and that had been, had been established over the course not just of the 5 consecutive presidential terms won by FDR and Truman, but that continued with Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson, and to some degree with those who followed them as well. This is an enormous, reconstruction of American government, and it is a total changing of what we think of as the norms, of what we think of as even things like the relationship between the courts and the executive branch. So you had a number of court decisions which continued to entrench these New Deal norms and procedures. And this included things like what ultimately comes to be called Chevron deference. This is where the courts say, well, you know what, everyone has to defer to regulatory agencies. agencies, these alphabet agencies that are ultimately a legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, they are the experts, and everyone from the courts to on down to presidents and the executive branch, everyone has to defer to these unelected figures in the alphabet agencies and in the government. Right now, you're seeing a battle where President Trump is trying to regain, I should say, the constitutional authorities of his office to fire executive branch officials. The executive branch, according to the Constitution, is under the president's control. The president is, the chief, executive officer of the country. He is the head of the executive branch. And yet the New Deal tried to create these executive agencies, these alphabet agencies, the administrative state, the deep state, which would be unaccountable to the president, and that they could not be fired because they claimed, well, no, we're in office because of our expertise, and Congress has given us this cover, and you have precedents going back to the New Deal, and therefore we are entrenched. We're supposedly, they claim to be nonpartisan. You have all these, things that are, outside of the government itself, but that are basically boards and, public-private partnerships and things, again, that are controlled by agents, that are agents that are agencies basically run by experts who are not accountable to the public. This is a completely different view of government than what you will find if you look at, what Americans were saying in the 19th century or going back to our founding fathers in the late 18th century. What you really have during the Roosevelt administration and then thereafter is a revolution against the American Constitution and a revolution against our way of life, basically. And yet, because this revolution happened 80 years ago, it has become second nature, even to people who would otherwise be critics of it, even to many conservatives, even certainly to a great many Republicans, until Donald Trump came along. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and if you've enjoyed this podcast, please click the like button and share this podcast and our others with your friends. You can find Modern Age on the web at www.modernAgeJournal.com, where every weekday you will find a new article, sometimes an original web piece, sometimes a piece drawn from our print magazine, and sometimes a classic drawn from our archives stretching back to 1957. But every weekday you will find a new piece that we are presenting for the World Wide Web and for today's generation. The Modern Age was founded by Russell Kirk and is the premier conservative intellectual journal, in print, online, and of course on social media, stretching back to the year 1957. Donald Trump is not really ending the conservative era, as Ross Douthat says, even though Donald Trump doesn't have this sort of overarching obsessive concern with small government and with dismantling the welfare state. That's not really what Trump's concerned about. But instead, he's attacking these other parts of the Franklin Roosevelt legacy. He wants to dismantle the kind of imperial internationalism in the name of liberalism that Franklin Roosevelt led America down to. And he's also, of course, taking on this ideology of free trade and this global free trade regime. What Donald Trump is doing is reclaiming American self-government. Not only is Trump reclaiming the powers of his office as the head of the executive branch, who is not subordinate to these alphabet agencies that Franklin Roosevelt created, but also President Trump is restoring the idea that Americans are responsible for having a foreign policy that is in our national interest, that is not simply safeguarding an international order or international system, and that our trade policy should again be devoted to our revenues, our industries, our workers, our jobs. It should not be about building a global system which may be to the advantage of the planet as a whole, but that is very detrimental to many Americans. So Trump is actually the man who is reversing so much of the New Deal, so much of what Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and their successors built. Donald Trump is defying the alphabet agencies. He's defying the administrative state. He's defying the deep state. He is putting our foreign policy back on a footing that more resembles that of the 1920s, or for that matter of the 19th century, or for that matter of our founding fathers like George Washington. It's also Donald Trump who is, throwing out this maniacal ideology of free trade. Donald Trump's not against trade. Donald Trump says we should have trade with the world, but it should be on our terms. We should negotiate bilateral treaties with a variety of countries. We should not think of ourselves as the guardians of a global system, a global economy that is predicated on free trade, which may not always be in the best interests of the American people and their industries and their jobs. So Trump is doing what the conservative movement of, the past 80 years claimed that it wanted to do, but never really did. And that includes, Donald Trump taking on so many of these alphabet agencies. Finally, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which again, a Republican Congress, when Republicans in the 1990s controlled the House and the Senate and had pretty strong majorities, they couldn't get rid of even the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Donald Trump has done it in the first year of his second term. So he has successes, even, if you want to judge things by the standards of the sort of Franklin Roosevelt conservatives of the 20th century and the early 21st century, even by their standards of just wanting to slightly take on some of these alphabet agencies and take on the welfare state, Donald Trump has some wins. But more importantly, Donald Trump is taking on the very heart and soul of Franklin Roosevelt's legacy, his ghost, for America in terms of foreign policy and in terms of trade and in terms of an executive branch that is not accountable to the American people because it's an executive branch of experts and alphabet agencies and not an executive branch accountable to the president who's actually elected by the American people. So this is, not so much the end of a conservative era. It's actually the beginning of a conservative era. And Donald Trump is not just a break with what's happened in the past 80 years, but he's a restoration of, many of the ideas and principles that had informed American government from the time of our founding fathers, who were generally non-interventionists in foreign policy and who believed that trade policy should serve the nation. They liked trade. They wanted to trade with the world, but they also believed that tariffs were important for revenue and that tariffs, had a strategic dimension as well and were necessary in our foreign policy. This was true for the founding fathers. It was true all the way through into the 1920s. And then the New Deal in the 1930s terminates all of that and creates a different kind of government and ultimately tries to create a different kind of nation and different kind of world in the aftermath of Franklin Roosevelt. So Donald Trump is restoring us to the conservatism that came before the New Deal and before Franklin Roosevelt, and the conservatism that in fact was characteristic of our founding fathers, of George Washington, of Alexander Hamilton, of John Adams, and other great founding fathers, John Quincy Adams as well. Now, let me say a few more words about this strange kind of conservatism which became an orthodoxy during the 80 years in which Franklin Roosevelt's vision was dominant in America. If you look at who some of the first critics of the New Deal were, they were actually progressives. They were actually liberals who didn't like the form of liberalism that Franklin Roosevelt was bringing to America. And so many of these, people who were progressives and liberals and Democrats, they became anti-New Dealers starting in the 1930s and into the 40s and beyond. And to a very great extent, a set of journalists who had previously been thought of as being on the left became some of the intellectual lodestars for early conservative figures in the 1950s, people like William F. Buckley Jr. Now, many of these ex-progressives and ex-liberals were very interesting figures. They were right about many things, and yet they were not necessarily people who ever identified themselves as conservatives. Really, we would today call them libertarians. And they made a migration from basically being on what would be considered kind of the libertarian left and the Democratic Party to being part of the conservative coalition after the Franklin Roosevelt era and after World War II. And they started, in fact, to become some of the defining voices, just as a number of ex-communists became defining voices of the anti-communist movement in the post-war era. This is not a bad thing necessarily. You want to win converts from the other side. So if you have liberals and progressives who change their views and want to come over and become conservatives, that's generally a good thing. But what actually happened is a little bit more complicated than that, because basically the connection between these progressives and liberals who started moving to the right simply because they opposed Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, the connection between them and conservatives was simply that they all opposed the welfare state. So you got a constricted version of conservatism in the 20th century, the late 20th century and early 21st century, which was really in many ways just the old liberalism. And in fact, you'll often hear a number of conservatives, many of whom are critics of Donald Trump, they will say today, well, conservatism is just classical liberalism. This idea would have been very shocking to a number of people who actually were conservatives, in the 18th century or in the 19th century. But it's something that a lot of conservatives came to believe in the 20th century because you had this immigration of a number of progressives and liberals who were classical liberals or progressives who were simply anti-statist, who moved from being on the left before Franklin Roosevelt to being allied with the right, after Roosevelt, because they saw Roosevelt as being basically, maybe a sort of version of American fascism, because again, the New Deal statism had a lot in common with the statism of Benito Mussolini's Italy, or who saw other aspects of the New Deal that they found repulsive. So the American conservatism of the 20th century, the late 20th century, and into the early 21st century, was often blended with a kind of anti-New Deal progressivism and anti-New Deal liberalism. And that's fine up to a point. Again, it's good to win allies, it's good to expand the tent and to have new friends. When it's bad, however, is when this displaces the actual conservatives and causes you to lose sight of the fact that conservatives had always been very critical of free trade in the 19th century. They had always been very critical of the kind of liberal internationalism that is characteristic of Franklin Roosevelt and the presidents going forward from him for most of the last 80 years. So Donald Trump has, for once, become a true anti-New Dealer, not just against the welfare state, he's rather against the entire apparatus and legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt as well. And Donald Trump is restoring us to the conservatism that existed during the American founding and throughout the 19th century. It's really, he's putting us back to our roots. But of course, there's a lot of complexity here, because in the 21st century, the question is, well, how do you take some of these foundational principles, this idea of America as a nation state that has to be first and foremost concerned with its own people and its own interests, how do you apply that to the complex world of the 21st century? And are there good elements about the conservatism that lived so much in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal? Nevertheless, were there elements of that conservatism that lived in Roosevelt's shadow in the 20th century that we do not want to throw overboard and that we think actually are important to conserve? So this is where the debate on the right is today. And this is why there is a lot of angst and anxiety, especially among older conservatives, who think that that Donald Trump and younger conservatives are betraying the fight against the New Deal and the fight against the welfare state, the fight against big government. That's not true. Rather, Trump and younger conservatives are actually fighting a much bigger battle against a much wider legacy of Franklin Roosevelt than these earlier, 20th century conservatives had been fighting. That doesn't mean that, big government and the welfare state are things that the right should embrace. In fact, there's still very much things that have worked to the detriment, especially of the family and of local community throughout the past 80 years. So that's one aspect of what I've been calling the conservatism that lived in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt that we may want to hang on to, this criticism of the welfare state. So it's one thing, I think, if older conservatives, baby boomers and others, some people in Gen X, my own generation, want to criticize the younger right and Donald Trump for not being critical enough of the welfare state. I think that's true. But you also want to give credit to the younger right and to the Trump administration for now being able to take on Franklin Roosevelt in so many respects that previously the conservative movement had not dared to tackle. So no, the era of conservatism is not over. In fact, the era of conservatism is beginning again, because now it is a much wider form of conservatism. This is, by the way, not simply something that you would hear from more traditionalist conservatives like myself, more paleo-conservatives. It's something that even folks such as Matthew Continetti, who is the son-in-law of Bill Kristol and therefore is kind of part of this great neoconservative dynasty. But Matthew Continetti wrote a book a few years ago called The Right, which is a history of American conservatism from the 1920s all the way through to 2020. And Continetti is not terribly sympathetic to President Trump, but he basically says that Trump is a return to the conservatism of Calvin Coolidge. And that was a conservatism that often was focused on immigration restriction, that wanted to avoid entangling alliances and international interventions abroad. And, in those respects, and also, certainly the Republicans of the Coolidge era were still largely supporters of tariffs and not supporters of free trade. So really Donald Trump, according to Matthew Continetti, who's not a Trump supporter or a paleocon, but Continetti also sees Trump as a restoration of an older conservatism. And similarly, there are a number of other thinkers, all across the political spectrum who have recognized this very interesting phenomenon. That's not, again, to say that Trump is just picking up exactly where Calvin Coolidge left off, but rather that, Trump has begun the fight back against this Franklin Roosevelt legacy in a way that younger conservatives are now going to have to continue. And whether that means Vice President Vance picks up the baton after this, or whether it means someone else does, or if future conservatives getting elected to office all the way, in Congress or in states, all of this has to be a broad rejection of this revolution that Franklin Roosevelt imposed on America and on the world, without, again, being so reckless as to say that everything that was done in the last 80 years was wrong. A lot of it was, the core philosophy was against the philosophy of America's own founding tradition, and yet that doesn't mean that we should, easily scrap, everything that has come between the years 1932 or 1933 and the year 2025. No, on the contrary, we have to be very cautious, even in trying to break free from some of these institutions and norms that have been imposed upon us by the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. And yet it is necessary work. We have to get back to the self-government that was the ideal for which we fought the American Revolution 250 years ago, and that was instantiated in our United States Constitution, and which we had abandoned in the latter half of the 20th century in favor of a global system rather than a system of American self-government.